So there are people out there that are consuming your data, and you may not know how they're using it. First off, I want to say thank you to our host, Eagle Dream Technologies, and the folks that helped put this on. So appreciate you all taking the time out today to come out and have this conversation with us. So disclosure, I'm here speaking on behalf of Tim Fitzgerald, not as of TIAA Bank. So from a legal perspective, anything that I say today, do not take as legal advice. I am not a lawyer, so just getting that out of the way up front. By show of hands in the audience, who here has been impacted or knows somebody close to them that has been impacted by identity theft? Wow, that's a lot. Show of hands, who in the audience here knows that their personal data has been stolen in a data breach? Okay, it's almost everybody. What about show of hands of people who are not sure if your personal data has shown up in a data breach? Okay, so that's scary. We'll talk a little bit about that today. So the topic for today that I'm going to speak about is managing customers' data in the digital world. We have an explosion of information that's being produced and stored about you all, and we've got to figure out how do we manage that so that we don't have the issues that we've talked about, like identity theft. So what we're going to talk about today is that there's an actual evolution in your rights in regards to the data that is captured and produced about you and what companies are doing with that information and how they're processing it, whether they're sharing it, and if they're selling it to other people. We're going to talk about what that means to companies and the evolution of the regulations that are coming about because of this. And then how do you ensure that your organization is going to be compliant in regards to this new legislation? So I was having a conversation the other day. When you talk about consumer or customer, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So if I go and I talk to my finance folks and say, how do you define our customers? Well, the response would be a customer is somebody who's got an account with us. They've got a balance, they're transacting. There's information that I have to publish in regards to showing up on our financial reports or an active relationship with us. Well, if I go and I talk to my marketing folks, they'll tell me, well, a customer is anybody that we've ever had a relationship with. They may have been an account 5 years ago. I've got all this data on them. I'm going to write a campaign and build a profile, and I'm going to try to cross-sell them new products. Well, if I go talk to my servicing folks, they'll go, well, Tim closed his account in January, but I still have to keep his data in our systems in case he calls in, or come tax time, he's got to get access to his 1099s. He's a customer of ours. And so when you think about it in that regard, depending on who you're talking to, a customer can mean many different things. A consumer, by some definition, is somebody who has a relationship from an engagement. Someone who walked into a bank branch is a consumer. When they become a customer, they have a relationship with us. But what I'm talking about is people. So at the end of the day, each and every one of you is a consumer or a customer for some institution, and you all have rights to know about who has access to your personal information and what are they doing with it. So when I talk about this today, you'll hear consumer, you'll hear customer. This is really about you because you have your data that's being pushed out in the ether and being consumed by these companies, and you need to know what your rights are in regards to that. So what's driving this conversation? This is it's getting a lot more press these days because of certain events that have occurred. The big one that a lot of people know about is Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. So Facebook, as you all know, most of you probably have an account with Facebook, captures a lot of information on you, your behaviors, your likes, your dislikes, your friends, your networks. Well, they then provide access to some of their partners for that data. Facebook claims they didn't know what Cambridge was doing with that data. They were using it for political purposes. So there are people out there that are consuming your data, and you may not know how they're using it. So things like that are causing awareness to be brought up. Because technology has increased the amount of information being produced, The ability to store it's gotten cheaper. The ability to process big data has gotten cheaper. So back in the day, the government used to take pictures of, if you think about when George W. Bush was in office and people were complaining because they found out that the government was tracking our phone numbers and who we were talking to, people were up in arms. Well, there was this project called Project Echelon that was back in the 80s. If you think about Epcot Center at Disney World, that big golf ball looking thing, you can go up to Northern Virginia, you'll see nondescript buildings that have a bunch of those little things, and inside of those, there are satellite dishes pointed to satellite communication, the satellites, and they're ripping down all the data that's going through that. Back in the day, they dumped them into Cray computers, the big supercomputers, and process looking for things like kill president, that kind of stuff. So that's been going on for years. But now, you don't have to have a Cray computer to process that data. You can actually use your laptop can process a lot of information. And if you needed the Cray computer type technology, you can go to an AWS, a cloud provider, and rent it. You can rent that processing power. So because of that, it's made it real easy for companies to be able to collect and store and process tons and tons of information. So that's created new industries, good and bad. So you've got these data amalgamators and brokers that are, their business models go out, screen scrape data from all these publicly available sites, build profiles on you, and then sell it. That's a good business model. There are also bad actors that are also selling data on the dark web. They're building profiles of you, but that's because they're not selling it to do targeted marketing. They're selling the data because they've grabbed a password and a login ID, and they're trying to sell that so people can hack you and ultimately end up with identity theft. So targeted advertising, these are strategies that businesses are trying to build profiles so they can figure out how to get the right product to the right person at the right price at the right time, because that gives the most value add to you as a consumer. But to do that, I've got to know a lot about you, a profile of you, your behavior patterns, and understand how do I engage you at the place you're going to be to make those offers for products and services. So that's what this targeted advertising is. We're getting better at it as an industry. We're not quite there. You know, example would be if I go onto Amazon and I'm looking at LED lights for my lawn. The next day I'll go to Facebook or I'll be on another site. I'm going to see ads, banner ads popping up for LED lights. What they didn't know is I bought those lights already. And for 2 more weeks, I'm seeing these banner ads of lights that I've already bought. And I'm like, okay, somebody's tracking me, someone's profiling me, but they don't know the whole story. So we're not there yet. But because of the change of technology, the ability to consume, store, and process all of this information about large groups of people has become much easier. And so that's brought us to a place where we've now got to figure out how do we control that, because there's the good and the bad. The good actors trying to build businesses out of it, and the bad actors that are trying to steal your data and do bad things. So talking about the folks who raised their hand to my last question of who doesn't know whether their data's been breached. So there's a site up here, I'm saying pawned, I don't know if that's how that's pronounced, but that's how I say it. Have I been pawned? If you go to that site, you can plug your email in, and it'll tell you if it finds your email address in one of these large data breaches. And there'll be a brief description in there about what the breach was, what the data was lost. So you can have an understanding of, geez, has my data been stolen from some company, and is it available in the dark web? The one on the bottom, and full disclosure here, this was a site that was built back in 2006. I went to go on it last night, and the technology was asking me to update my Java to run the app, which is the interactive component to it, and it was on a secure site and everything else. So if you try to go to the site, you can actually navigate through the site itself, but the app may require you to do some finagling, and that's the fun part about it. But the point of this organization, We Feel Fine, it was a partnership between an artist and a math guy, and what they did was they wanted to do an experiment and understand how they could see the psyche of how people were feeling. So what their technology did was they went out, and every 10 to 15 minutes they grab snapshots of blogs from all over the planet, and they search for the word feel, or I'm feeling. And then they go to the left, to the end of the sentence, and to the right. And they grab that whole dialogue, and they store it. And then what they do is they'll go to the blog site, they'll get the metadata of whose site it is, where it's located, local weather, and they'll bring that together. And then what they produce is views of how different demographics are feeling. So what they do is they've taken 5,000 words and said, look for happy words, angry, angst, positive things, and then they produce BI information that you can then see what's the happiest state, what's the happiest country, was the weather impacting people's emotions that day. No real business value, it's just interesting, but to know that you can actually, on this picture here, this is a moving bunch of dots. Those are all blog posts. You can actually grab a dot, drill down, and go exactly to that blog. The point here is that there's people out there grabbing the stuff that you're publishing out there because it's available, and they're using it for purposes that you would never even thought of. And that's just something you need to be aware of, that because it's out on the web, it's consumable by multiple people, and you need to know that you also have rights. Okay, so someone asked me earlier, is there anyone looking out for us to protect us in this space? And the answer to that is yes. So there are laws and regulations that have been put in place to protect us, to make sure that the most sensitive of our information is protected by these companies that are buying it and consuming it. So back in '96, we had HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act. So that was put in place to ensure that hospitals and medical facilities that have the most sensitive of information about you all and your conditions are protecting it so that it's not abused. In the financial industry, we had Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. That was back in '99. So we collect a lot of very sensitive information on you about you, your social, your credit history, your income. We need all this data to be able to give you financial products and services. That's really sensitive information. So the government created laws that require us to protect it, to ensure and to regulate that we are doing the right things to make sure your data is protected. GDPR, this was a 2018 regulation that went into effect in the European Union. What we all in the industry refer to as kind of the blueprint to what we're seeing today in the legislation that's coming out in the United States. That was a regulation that protects customers' data, gives them the rights to go to a company and ask them, what data do you have on me? What are you doing with it? And if you're using it for things that are not part of your business, I want you to delete it. I also want you to give me copies of it. So that's going in the EU. The penalties of being non-compliant to that can be up to 4% of your global income. So the exposure levels are quite large. CCPA is a California Consumer Privacy Act that went into effect January 1st. So this was a law based off of the EU, and this is kind of the blueprint, where it's giving people in the state of California the right to know the things of what companies that are doing business in California are doing with the customer's data. There's tripwires, like you have to have 25,000 customers or $50 million in income. So it's targeted towards bigger companies. But there are laws that are in effect, and they're continuing to grow popularity. And so there is a big push up on the Hill to get a federal law in effect. So Michael Crapo from Idaho partnered up with, he's the head of the chairman of the Banking Business Committee. He produced legislation with his Democratic partner to try to get a federal law to protect customers' data. That got stalled up on the Hill, and we don't think that that's going to make it through due to our political climate with what's going on. So what's happening is the states are taking the action into their own hands, California being the first. There are numerous states that are actually producing legislation to protect you as people in your rights for data. The challenge for companies is that when you have 50 different rule books that you're going to have to follow, that becomes really, really expensive and hard to do and to manage. It's very costly. But that's what's happening. And so as your organizations, you're going to have to learn what you have to do to be compliant to make sure that you're protecting your customers' information. Okay, so as I talked about, what do these rights look like? So GDPR being that kind of playbook for a lot of these states they're basing this draft legislation off of, it's allowing customers to know, what data do you have on me? How did you collect it? Where did you get it from? What are you doing with it? What was the business purpose for you to collect that data? I need to understand that. And oh, by the way, I want you to delete it, or I have the right to say you cannot sell my information to other companies. Notices, so you have to be able to give notices back to, when I ask that question, you've got to provide answers to me. You've got to provide me what the information you have, down to the specific information that you have on me. I need to see that. I actually filed my request with Apple, and I watched, and it took them a couple of days, and they produced zipped files of all the data they had on iCloud and calendars and notes and music and all this stuff. And when you think about what goes into having to respond to these things, it's not a small undertaking. So as I stated, all these things, I've got to be able to respond to folks. How long are you keeping my data? So I worked in Richmond, Virginia for a long time where Philip Morris was headquartered, and I had friends that worked there. And Philip Morris found out the hard way that retaining information can get you in hot water. So they thought they were smart by not having long retention on their email policies, and most of their work was done over the phone. What they didn't realize was that all those voicemails were actually digital footprints that can be subpoenaed. And those got subpoenaed, and that got them in trouble with a lot of the smoking litigation that they were faced with. So what happens now, and I'm not sure if it's still there, but back when I was in Virginia, I had friends that said after that, at Philip Morris, you could only leave a voicemail that clipped off after 10 seconds because they got bit from having that being used against them. So if you keep data as a company and store it, just know that it can be used against you. So if there's no business value, it's probably risk versus reward. Know what you're doing. Third parties, so I need to be able to say, hey, I'm sharing data with customers, with third parties. That's normal practice. If I'm in banking and I have loans that people don't pay back and I've got to do collections, I don't want to do that for my business. I may outsource that to somebody. But to do that, I've got to give them Tim Fitzgerald and all his relevant information so they can actually do the collections. So I also have to know that I'm accountable for that third-party vendor, and something happens there, it's on me as an organization because I'm using them. I'm the one who has to respond to the privacy laws because it's my customer. And I also, by the way, I have to know that my customer may be using vendors as well. I call that a fourth party. So do you know what vendors are using other vendors and the controls they have and how they're protecting your customers' data? It's your exposure on that. So there is exceptions to some of these laws about de-identifying. So I could spend a whole day talking about techniques of de-identifying data, but there are reasons why I may want to know about the behaviors of the Tim Fitzgeralds coming to my website. What are they doing? What are they looking at on our site? I don't need to know it's Tim. I need to see what the masses are doing. So I may take all the Tim stuff out, but keep the other data so I can do analysis to see what's happening in the marketplace. Those are things where we can get the customer components out. That kind of data I can still keep. So that kind of stuff is written into these legislations. Channels needed, so you're going to have customers coming at you on the web. They're going to be calling you on the phone, your call centers. If you've got offices, bank branches, people going in, sending you letters, these laws, you're going to have to deal with those different channels and be consistent about how you're responding, accepting requests, and responding to folks. And then also, you've got to know how to track whether or not you're compliant. How can you prove or disprove to a regulator or and if you get brought up in a lawsuit, that you actually are complying with the law? So you got to keep track of these things. So you've got to have a way to manage and produce reporting on what's happening, who's asking for their data, and that you're complying in a timely manner. You've got to be able to prove that with an Etch-a-Sketch when put on the stand. So this is my view. If I'm thinking about CCPA, in the financial industry, we have this thing called the GLBA exception, Graham-Leach-Bliley. So because the government requires us to maintain and store data on our customers to prove we're not lending money to terrorists for OFAC reasons or for the Bank Secrecy Act, we're not laundering money, I have the right to tell a customer that I have to keep this data. So there are some things that are an exception. And so the way I would categorize that is saying that we have systems that have data in it because you have a product or service with us. I've got systems in our call centers and our digital technology for doing digital self-servicing, or if you call in a service your account, I got to put your data in there so they can provide those functions for us. And then I got risk management that is actually looking at fraud, money laundering, things to make sure that there's no bad actors out there. All of those things and the systems that have that, if I know where those are, I can say those are out of scope. So when solving these problems around what data I have about customers, I really focus my energy on things that I lump up as decision support. So that's data that I go out and buy about you. That's data that I'm profiling and that I'm creating to make marketing decisions or to do analysis on. That's the stuff that I need, that you have the right to tell me to get rid of if you don't want me keeping it. So, are you prepared as an organization? This is one of those scary slides to say, if you go back to your company and say, do you know what data we have? Where is it? Have you classified it? There are data classifications like, is it restricted? Is it highly confidential? Is it public? Is it private? Is it internal? You have to have security measures based on classification. So the security that you have for highly restricted data is different than public. But if you're not aware of the data you have, you don't know where it is, and you haven't classified it, how can you put a control in place? So do you know where your data is? Do you have the security measures that, to set up for the classifications? If you're a company and you're doing business, there's a privacy policy. You've got to send privacy statements to folks that you have their data. What are you doing? Are you securing the data as you're sending it? If I outsource it to a third party, how am I securing that data as it goes out when I send it to them over the web or through a virtual private network? Am I encrypting it? Do you have those in place? Are you retaining your data? How long are you keeping it? Do I have customer consent? Some states have the requirement where most states tell you they have the option to opt out. You can call me and say, hey Fitz, I don't want you to market to me. I don't want you to sell my data. That's an opt-out. You have that right. Some states have an opt-in. So where the default is you can't do anything until I reach out to the customer and say, hey, can I get your consent to actually use your data? Security, storing of the data. So if someone breaches our network, how am I storing the data? What are the access controls? Can anyone in the company just make an access to get access to a database or a system that has all of your personal social security numbers exposed? What controls do we have in place to ensure that? Third-party vendors, as I talked about before. Your vendors that are working on your behalf, do you know the controls they have in place? Because you're accountable. Do you have that written into your contracts? Do you have data governance programs inside that provide transparency into who has access to your data? Your marketing folks want access to everything. They want to see everything. They want to see all. You don't realize that your employees sometimes are customers. And if marketing can go in and see all that stuff, do you know that your marketing department has access to your social, where you live? And if you're in a bank, they can see your money. Do you know that? These are the kind of things that some companies don't have good handles on. Training and education, so all these channels, your branches, your call center reps, people are getting letters. Do they know the laws? Do they know what they can respond to, what they can say, and what they can't? Are you guys prepared for that? Incident management. What do you do when you do have a breach? Do you have a process in place to help deal with that? And then again, I'll talk about reporting and disclosures. Do you have those set up? If you don't, you need to start thinking about that, because that's a lot of stuff that you need to do, and you don't want to be on the back end of that. Capital One. So here's a great example. As was said before, I worked at Capital One with huge consumers of data. Capital One spent a lot of time and energy and money building out their brand. What's in your wallet? Well, Rob Alexander, the CIO, he made the decision to say, you know, we're a software company. We're not in the business of running a data center. There's no value to that for us. That's not a skill set that we want to spend money on. So we outsourced it. So you got to AWS, Amazon. They should have their things under control, correct? Well, they actually had a problem with an old employee, third party, that breached. There's a cost to that. Not only is there penalties but there's a cost to your brand. So Capital One gets splashed all over the news in social media about losing all their customer data. So all that time and energy spent in building that up, that's now impacted because of a vendor partner. So what you need is these companies like Eagle, Dream Technologies to help you navigate as you're going through and leveraging partners in the cloud. Those are the things that can happen if you don't know what you're doing. The next steps to consider, as those things that I listed out, do an assessment. Are you guys ready? You know, how prepared are we? I would say create a central location to know what assets and customer data that you have. Where is it located? Have you classified it? So that when you have to take action, you can go to one place and use that as a starting point. Again, if you categorize your data into those buckets, the ones that are kind of running your business, you should be able to keep. It's the ones where you're purchasing data or you're building profiles, the marketing stuff, that'll help you reduce the scope. So if you categorize things, it takes a big hairy problem and boils it down into digestible chunks. Understand your vendor partners. So what are your vendor partners doing for you? What data do they have? Understand that. Think about how you're going to have to take these requests as these new laws go into effect. You're going to have to respond to them. This is not a would like to do, but must do. You've got to be able to know what are you going to respond with? How are you going to package that up? What channels? How do you manage it? You need to be able to have the ability to do the deletion. If someone says, get rid of my data, I don't want you to keep it, and my law says you have to, you got to have a process for that, and you got to prove that you did it. So these are things that if you haven't thinking through these things, you need to start.